Likewise, there are no words to properly express our outrage, and I think the outrage of all Americans, at the despicable act, following as it does on the one perpetrated several months ago in the spring that took the lives of scores of people at our embassy in that same city, in Beirut. But I think we should all recognize
2023 marks the 40th anniversary of the despicable suicide bombing attack on the Marine Barracks in Beirut, Lebanon. On the 23rd of October, 1983, 220 Marines, 18 Navy sailors, and 3 U.S. Army soldiers lost their lives at the Marine Barracks in Beirut. You are not forgotten. Another 128 Americans were wounded in the massive explosion, 13 of whom later died of their injuries, and those are counted amongst the 241 fatalities. Troops at the Marine Corps Barracks in Beirut were awakened at about 6:22 in the morning when a suicide bombing took place at the barracks. This massive explosion was so intense, it was one of the largest explosions, non-nuclear, in the history of humankind. It lifted the building off of all of its moorings, concrete moorings, into the air, and then collapsed on top of those in the barracks. President Reagan had sent Marines into Lebanon at the request, an invitation of the Lebanese government, towards what was supposed to be the end of their civil war. This was supposed to be a peacekeeping mission, but others intervened to cause this horror. Now, the site of the bombing was Marine Barracks at Lebanon's Beirut International Airport, where these soldiers died. 241 Marines, Navy sailors, and U.S. soldiers. That event 40 years ago occurred just a week before I first entered the United States Army on November 2nd, 1983. I remember poignantly. I'll never forget it. And to those sailors, the soldiers, and the Marines who lost their lives that day, we will not forget you. To their loved ones, the suffering, the sorrow, the grief they've gone through 40 years ago and the ensuing 40 years, and the challenges they face today, we can only offer our eternal gratitude for your sacrifices. At the time of the Beirut Marine Barracks bombing, suicide bombings were not something Americans were accustomed to, or people in the Middle East for that matter, for the most part. But it's something, sadly, we've become all too familiar with in the past 40 years. This was not the only bombing that morning. Just moments later, just minutes after the Marine Barracks was bombed, French were also hit. 58 French troops and 6 civilians died in a separate suicide bombing just minutes after the Marines were attacked. Initially, my sight was drawn by the sun's almost blinding reflection coming from a shiny belt buckle cinched around the waist of a stretcher's cargo. What makes the image so unforgettable is that there was no body above the belt buckle. This from a member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, Post 9862 in Gaithersburg, named Madaris. His recollections in the aftermath of this, a service member who half his torso was missing. These graphic images and thoughts should not escape our mind in a world full of evil people. And we stand on that post to defend our freedoms and liberties. Thank a service member, thank a veteran, thank their family members for the sacrifices they make on our behalf. God bless.
To make this statement, I know there are no words that can express our sorrow and grief over the loss of those splendid young men and the injury to so many others. I know there are no words also that can ease the burden of grief for the families of those young men.